Well, hello there, how is everyone? I hope you are all well on this amazing Halloween. That's right, baby, it's Halloween. You're looking amazing, by the way. And how amazing do I look? For those of you who joined the line, you would have seen a sneak preview of this, but look, we've got to do it, haven't we? It's Halloween, so let's get in the mood. Let's get in the mood and tuck into some meat and potatoes. As we talk about mind games, some of you would have watched the Drip Drop video, and he did some booms, absolute booms, and you know, we've got something to talk about because he specifically spoke about mind games. Now, he was talking about mind games, and what he was saying was that he was perhaps misconstrued when he was talking about the truck, the U-Haul truck, and he was talking about the fact that Moscow PD had got this U-Haul truck with Pennsylvania down the side of it, and people like saying, oh, you can get these trucks from anywhere in the state, they can, you know, you can get one from Pennsylvania, use it, and that'll be dropped off in another state, and so on and so forth. And he was like, that's not the point I'm trying to put across. What he believed was that Moscow PD were playing potential mind games with Bryan Kohberger, and that what they were trying to do would be to give out subtle hints in the public. Like, they would talk about the fact that they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, but there was just something that was off. So they were on the right track, but they hadn't quite got it down, you know what I mean? So they weren't looking for his, so it would leave a little bit of doubt in there, maybe sort of give a little bit of false confidence. And then they would talk about the Pennsylvania truck and the fact that that was, you know, displaying Pennsylvania down the side. And I saw a lot of people in comments turn around saying, no, they wouldn't be doing this, you're an idiot, and, you know, really going hard in the paint with the fact that this is not something that they would do. And I thought to myself, you know what? I believe that that is a high probability. Now, imagine if they had been tipped off. Imagine that someone had given them Bryan Kohberger's details. They had said, look, this is the guy. This is the guy who did this crime, but we can't prove it. You know what I mean? We can't prove that he was there. We don't have anything, but we can tell you it was him. So what would they do? What would they do? And I'm thinking to myself, well, is it beyond the realms of possibility that they would try and do something that would trigger a reaction from Bryan? Is it something that is just completely impossible, and it's not something that they would do? And I thought to myself, you know what, I could actually see a law enforcement sort of outfit doing something like this, because it then forces that person's hand. They would look to see whether, you know, whether they do anything out of the ordinary, whether they do something like try and escape, try and get out of Dodge, do you know what I mean? And then we saw Bryan Kohberger obviously doing the drive with his dad from Washington all the way across to Pennsylvania. He stopped during this time as well, and you wonder whether that is all part of the same thing, to see whether once he is stopped, and not just stopped once but stopped twice, whether he then starts to behave in a different manner on that journey. Does he change where he's going? Does, you know, his manner of driving start becoming different, erratic maybe? And I see that as something very, very plausible, and I think those that dismiss that, I think, are wrong in doing so. I believe that that is highly probable that this was indeed what was going on, this almost like a cat and mouse game. But there's more to it, because I think to myself, if that's the case, then that does mean that there are other elements of this case that are not perhaps as we thought. Like, we believed at some point there was a potential that perhaps the knife sheath had been planted, perhaps it had been planted by law enforcement. There's some confusion around the PCA and when this was specifically found, and how it was found, and how it was displaying the emblem on the leather, so on and so forth. And, you know, the PCA seemingly written by two different people, and it's supposed to be two different accounts of what they saw, but they're almost like they're a copy and paste of one another, which some people have found that very, very bizarre, me included. But look, it is what it is. But with respect of, if this is indeed what Moscow PD were doing, it was this cat and mouse game, and they were trying to get a reaction out of Bryan Kohberger, and does that mean that law enforcement definitely 100% had nothing to do with any form of setting up, and this was purely about following up on a lead? You know, this was about trying to get somebody to react in a certain way because they needed further proof of their involvement after they were given that information. I still believe that they were tipped off about Bryan Kohberger, 100%. They did not do investigative work that led them to this perpetrator, and then they further did that. But in my opinion, it didn't work that way. This was a tip-off. Someone said, this is the guy you need to be looking at, he's your guy, and they had to reverse engineer a caseload around him and make it work. And I believe it's a high probability that part of that was to put out stuff that they knew that he would see, because they knew that he would be watching. Because let's think this, and that is that if he was indeed guilty, he would have indeed been watching. He would have indeed been watching the press conferences, he would have been watching to see how Moscow PD were reacting, what they knew, what they didn't know, everything. He would have been all over it. And we know that he was watching the news because we know that he was keeping an eye on the likes of Bryan Kohberger, and when he had lost his life at the hands of the SWAT team. So look, he was keeping his eye on the news, and, you know, 28-year-old keeping an eye on the news. I certainly weren't that interested in the news. When I was 28, I'd be listening to music, making, you know, whoever was in the car listening while I was singing my heart out to the likes of Spice Girls. Not really. But you know what I mean. But he's listening to news. He's keeping an eye on what's being reported in the news, and maybe that's just part of his intellectual being. He's that kind of guy. He's not a music lover. He's a news lover. He's a law enforcement, education lover. But I think to myself, right, so if law enforcement weren't involved in some kind of setup and we've got completely off base end, you still have to take into consideration, alright then, who pointed them in the direction of Bryan Kohberger? And who would have wanted to point them in the direction of Bryan Kohberger? And I think to myself, you know what, from what we've heard about Bryan Kohberger being this harsh marker and, you know, and people having a problem with him in general, I do think to myself that, bearing in mind that this is a very student-heavy community, someone could have just been pissed off with Bryan Kohberger. It could have been someone who Bryan Kohberger had marked crap, who had been, he had been harsh with, he had been a bit of a dick to, one of these people who, you know, a bit of a, don't like being told when their work ain't as good as what it should be. And maybe they just rung in a tip and said, oh, we've got this, you know, weirdo bloody tutor, and I think you need to take a look at him because he was behaving funny in the days after this. He drives a white Hyundai Elantra. I believe it was potentially a student that tipped them off to Bryan Kohberger. I do believe that is a high probability that a student tipped them off. Let me know down below what you think. Do you think that that's a possibility, that a student had tipped them off and said that they need to keep an eye on Bryan Kohberger? And that's how the security guy managed to find Bryan Kohberger's car in the car park of the university over in Washington. That's what started the entire ball rolling. And obviously then we have law enforcement trying to reverse, you know, to get this case built around this guy, rather than building a case and it pointing towards a guy. But yeah, I believe that Moscow PD very likely had Bryan Kohberger in their sights right from the very, very start. Right from the start. And yeah, he was their guy. And all of this stuff that we saw put out in social media was, like Drip Drop alluded to, and that was that this was about, not about giving the public information, this was about playing a game with somebody. This was about playing a game with a man that they had in their sights and wanted to see whether he was going to react in a certain way. Now, does it mean Bryan Kohberger is innocent or guilty? No, it doesn't. It just means that it's how Moscow PD dealt with the information that they were given. And, you know, the fact that Bryan Kohberger was the target of that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It still does mean that there's a potential that someone just had it in for Bryan Kohberger, and that's how this entire thing went down. And the fact that Bryan Kohberger just didn't have an alibi, and he fitted the bill for some of the things that were happening in this crime, like the white car that could have well been a white Hyundai Elantra, and he just happens to drive a white Hyundai Elantra. But we know that there's so many other Hyundai Elantras in this area, so it doesn't really prove anything. That's this culmination of multiple things. And, you know, the knife sheath was the damning thing. The biggest thing that I have to question, though, is if Bryan Kohberger was indeed just someone tipped off and said, you need to go and check this guy out because there's something just not right about him, then it would be a huge coincidence for his DNA to then be on that knife sheath. That would be almost like a eureka moment, like 1 in a million. He gets wrongfully accused on some sort of stitch up by someone who's in a mood with him, and it just so happens that on a knife sheath that's found in the place, his DNA's on it. And that's why this DNA procedure, this IgG information is so important. It's showing exactly the entire process of this DNA and how it got on the sheath, because to me it's almost like someone tipped them off. It was Bryan Kohberger. Potentially they needed something, and DNA was the key. Let's get DNA on this sheath, and we've got a guy. Maybe there were so many other things that pointed to the fact he was someone who didn't have an alibi. He had a car that they believed they were looking for. You know, his phone details showed that there was a potential that his phone was switched off. They were very, very convinced that this was the guy, but they needed a smoking gun, and they were going to get it any way they saw fit, even if it went through traipse and through bins to get it. But we need to see all this IgG. Very important we do it. Will we see it? Will we not? I don't know. But if we don't, I have a feeling that there's going to be some big problems in this case. There could be fireworks. And, you know, who knows? You'll have to let me know down below what you think. Do you think that Moscow PD were indeed playing games with Bryan Kohberger? Or is this just another rabbit hole that we've fallen down and we're just barking up the wrong tree? Mind games. This entire case is nothing but mind games. But anyway, that's me. There's only going to be one video today because it's Halloween. We all need to go and get in the spirit of things and go and do something better than sit around on YouTube. So I'm going to love you and leave you, and I'll catch you all in the next one.